Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's masterclass. Unfortunately, you have me and not my gorgeous wife, Rebecca, to look at for the day, but I'm sure we can still get you some valuable information that can help you in this trying time. So we've had a couple of people reach out about their property, and obviously when people lose jobs, they lose income, and if they can't pay rent, your investment suddenly doesn't look as good as it did 6 months ago. So we've grabbed some experts to come in and talk to you. We've got Mike Harvey from On Your Side Investments, and we've got Rob McCaskill from Cyber SMF. So I just wanted to introduce you guys. And Mike, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, On Your Side Investments. I started that off because I had a lot of demand from friends who had bought property. I was a property investor for many years, ended up working in the industry. Become a Queensland sales manager for people I thought were good, but they turned out to be very shark-like, basically. So when I left that out of principle, a lot of their clients followed me and asked me for help around managing their issues and then how to get the next property. So that was the birth of On Your Side Investments, probably 6 years ago now.
Yeah, fantastic. And you've obviously written that #1 bestseller, Property Investment, Beware for the Sharks.
How to jump into property investing without being eaten by sharks. You got it.
I knew there were sharks in there, but the wording was a bit...
There's sharks everywhere, mate. Everywhere.
Yeah. And so important. Like, it's about that trust and making sure you get the right advice, because these decisions you make today affect you for the next 20 years of you owning that loan anyway.
It's not like buying a bad cup of coffee or even a bad TV set. You buy a bad property and you're stuck with it, the problems with it for a decade or so.
Yeah, totally. And then Rob, tell us a bit about yourself.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Ed. So Cyber SMSF is a business designed specifically to accountants in the preparation and compliance of their self-managed super fund needs. My wife and I also have a property management business, and I'm going to talk today from the aspect of property management. So Custodian Realty looks after residential tenancies all across the Gold Coast. So we're going to focus predominantly on what's happened with some of the rules that are in Queensland for you today.
Fantastic. So during today, we're going to talk about 3 key areas. The first one is residential. The second one is commercial. And the third one is about the insurance and what you're actually protected for with that. Now, our insurance expert, Sue Ellen, is having a bit of trouble getting on. So if she doesn't get on today, we'll get the answers recorded for those questions and sent out as well. So if you're watching the replay and you have an insurance question, comment below this and we'll get it answered. Or if you want to know the answer to those insurance questions, please comment so that we can make sure we send you those answers. We'll have a couple of guests joining in, as you can see, popping up around, but we will get straight into the first part, which is the residential. So I think there's a heap going on in the residential world, but the bottom line comes down to property owners that own the investment properties wanting to know, what are my rights? Am I going to get paid? How do I deal with this? How do I not lose money on what can really stretch them if that income dries up? So, Mike, I'm going to throw it to you to start off with to take the lead on that question.
Thanks, Ed. There's a bit of a lot of time being spent lately. I'm probably spending more time talking to my clients about their problems and fears than anything else. I've said to my clients up until now, it's not the right time to buy more property, but make sure you get ready. It's all about making sure you shore up where you're at. Just look at like the boys were talking about last week with mortgages. Money's never been cheaper, so make sure you shore up your mortgage, know where you're at, push them on price for that. And then obviously know where you're at, talk to your property managers to make sure of what your rights are. And it's the good thing about people in our situation, Rob, myself and so forth, is that we've got investment property ourselves. Been around it for many years, of course. And in some cases, I've got some real case studies of my own on tenants. I've got one in Melbourne, for example, that's lost their jobs and got no income whatsoever. So what we can do in that scenario. And that just brings a whole pile of questions through for ourselves on what the rights are for tenants to start with, because we need to be empathetic and careful and kind, of course. But at the same token, there's all sorts of tenants out there. Hopefully you've been smart and got a great property manager like a Rob and got good people in. But if you've got problem ones, now's the time it's really important to know what your rights as a landlord is or are on terms of how to handle that. And of course the insurance question comes in then too. So I've got tenants in a Brisbane property of mine who were being mischievous beforehand. and they thought they could play the game, and they've got the COVID-19 problem themselves, and they stopped paying rent. In that situation, my advice to clients like myself, in my situation, was to push them hard, and we issued breach notices and so forth. Even though we want to be kind, you can do that sort of thing. In fact, we actually issued a notice to vacate, which then made them pay. Because the bottom line for property investors, or if you've got property like that, you've got to be very careful that understand where your tenants are at, communicate closely with your property manager, and understand where your tenants are at. So you can either be kind or you can be firm with them to get the right result. And because, yep.
Yeah, and fantastic. And I think we're talking to a lot of business owners at the moment. Yeah. And I think there are businesses that are struggling now, but they're struggling now with problems that they've had previously. And you've talked about that in the residential, like some of the owners out there will be having problems with tenants that, to be honest, have been bad tenants for months. And so it's the COVID is just the latest problem that's come up for them, and it's how to deal with those. And obviously having that open communication is really important between both of you.
I might throw to Rob on that question as well, because we talked about that ourselves privately, about how there's some similarities between how you manage a residential tenancy and how you manage a commercial tenancy. So Rob, on the commercial tenancy, if a commercial business is down 50%, say, in their turnover, how do you go about, what are their rights, what are the tenants' rights, and what can the landlord inspect in that case?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Commercial's a little bit different to residential. We've had some really clear guidelines on residential with the release of some really some great information from the Queensland government. Commercial, we've got some instructions from the Australian government, but none of it's been legislated. So what we have in place at the moment are best practice guidelines. And essentially the best practice guidelines are there to try and introduce some really good faith principles, is what they refer to. So in short, what they're suggesting is that if you've got a business that is COVID impacted, it only applies to small to medium entities, so not big businesses, that a reduction in rent should be equivalent to the loss in turnover that they've received. So if they've received a 50% reduction in turnover, then they should be eligible to approach their landlords and negotiate a 50% either deferral or reduction in the commercial rent.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we'll get into commercial in a little bit more detail in a moment as well. But switching back to residential, Rob, what I'd love to know from you is, what can property managers be doing better to manage their tenants, so that any investor knows what they can do, what they should be getting from their property managers, so that they've got questions and things that they can be talking to them about to make sure they're getting the best service?
Look, I think Mike hit the nail on the head. Communication has always been the key of the property manager. They're the agent that acts between the owner and the tenant, and their job is to be really clear with communications. Right now, it's also a really strong case for their negotiation skills. You don't want to be sitting there having the tenant or the owner pull the wool over your eyes for the wrong reasons. We've got to be really empathetic to everyone's position at this point in time, whether they are owners or whether they are tenants. And the role of the property manager is really to ensure that both parties are playing on as level a playing field as possible. So really clearly communicating with everybody and following some really clear guidelines on if tenants are impacted, there's certain things that they need to do to prove that they want to either seek a reduction in rent or that they want to end a tenancy.
Yeah, fantastic. So a couple of case scenarios I'd like to give to you for your general advice to the people that own properties out there specifically, not so much the tenant-wise. I think our audience is more the property owner and how they can look after their investment. So the first case is, I own a property and the tenant is still paying rent and I haven't heard anything. What should I do?
Just keep going like you always have.
Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So really just a case of just keep your eye on it, but there's no need to bring any conversations to the front or to trigger anything. Just keep operating as normal.
Your property manager should be recording or receiving rent on a regular basis, and I would suggest in this current climate you'd be doing it daily. you could do it twice a day if you wanted, but banks aren't always that helpful in getting information through.
Yeah.
But really being on top of anyone that's even a day behind in the rent and just picking up the phone and just asking questions.
Yeah. So the main thing I take away for that for property owners is if you're not sure what your property manager is doing, just talk to them and make sure that they're letting you know as soon as your tenants are late on their payment, so that you're armed with the best information.
From an investor's point of view, Ed, investors need to be talking to their property managers and assessing how close the property manager is to each of their tenant situation. I've seen some very good property managers, of course, of which one Rob is, which is why he's here. But I've seen some good property managers both here and interstate who, when I've called them about my properties or my clients' properties, they'll go, yes, I've been in touch with that client, they're okay. Or I've been in touch with that client, they've got an issue. And they're already, a good ones are already ahead of that game. So I've got one in Melbourne, for example, who would sent off the legislation from the Victorian state government to that tenant, give them some information about where they could get some claims, some rent relief, etc. In fact, this guy even organised to get some food delivered for them, so it's pretty amazing. So if you talk to your property manager, it's their job to make sure they're close enough to where the tenant is, and make sure they're there to help the tenant pay your rent for you.
And I think what you said before about tenants that were a problem before COVID and now a problem during COVID, love your mug. Leaky. Yeah, some people don't know they're getting one. Hide it. It's the same with property managers. Like if you know they're a good one, you'll know that. But if there's been problems and you're not sure about it before COVID, then there's probably going to be worse during COVID. So there are identifiers for you to be on top of your property manager.
I'd probably just add to that, Ed, the difference between proactive and reactive. I know what we did. We sat down and we went through our tenancy database and we identified every job, every career that our tenants had to see whether their industry would be affected by COVID, and followed that up with not only phone calls but emails to let them know that whilst they might be okay at the moment, communication was the key at this point in time, and they needed to let us know as soon as any circumstances changed.
Yeah, fantastic. So my second scenario to throw to you guys is I've got a tenant in one of my properties and they've started to default.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend?
Okay, it's Rob, sorry. I'll shut
All
up.
right. I think the legislation is quite clear. You can't do anything until 7 days. So from an official standpoint, you can't do anything until 7 days of arrears has accrued. But you can certainly be contacting them, making phone calls, sending text messages, inquiring, is everything okay? You know, you normally pay rent on a Wednesday. We didn't see it this week. You know, sometimes it might be a bank issue. Sometimes employers do, have issues with their payroll. It happens sometimes. But start that communication. Once that 7 days has accrued, there's a new form that's been introduced during COVID, and it's called a show cause form. And the tenants need to show cause as to why they're unable to pay rent. Basically, are they COVID affected? And there's a whole guideline there that they have to satisfy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Mike?
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of those, like you said before, there's those who are delinquent types beforehand, and those who may be opportunistic, and those who are having genuine serious issues. So that's where your property manager needs to get in and that show cause it's no more information, I don't believe, than what it would be when they're applying for the tenancy to start with. So that'll give you an idea of how they're situated, and then you can handle that in the best way possible. So to take it to the next phase, I suppose, of that is, if they do have a problem as a landlord or property owner, what do you do? And you've got to take your property manager's advice, but at the end of the day, they've got to take your instruction. So that's when you need to be talking to someone like a Sue Ellen about your insurances, because I've seen some people who have thought, oh, the poor dears, I'll just drop their rent by $200 a week over the next 2 months, whatever else. And that's nice and kind, but it just chops them out of most insurance policies. So it's probably a good question for Sue Ellen to touch on.
Yeah, that's a great time to flip over to Sue Ellen. So Sue Ellen, I'll just get you to introduce yourself. So as part of today's masterclass, we've got an insurance expert in. So Sue Ellen, can you just tell us who you are, what you do?
Thank you, Ed. Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm a little bit late joining, but I'm Sue Ellen Greaves. CoverMax Insurance Advisement is my business, and we're insurance brokers. We help businesses and individuals protect their commercial and residential properties and business insurance. Unlike insurance companies in the direct market, we act on behalf of clients, not the insurance companies. So where you've got a claim or a query, or you need advice about what type of insurance is best for your situation, that's where we really come into play. So as insurance brokers, we act on your behalf and not the insurance company. Our mantra is that insurance needs to match our clients' attitude to risk as well as their budget. So definitely an important part of the whole process.
Yeah, fantastic. And so what are some of the things that landlords or owners, property owners, really need to be aware of in terms of their insurance at the moment?
Well, we're kind of at the end of the process from what Rob and Mike have spoken about already, in that if a property investor has a tenant that is unable to pay rent or decides for whatever reason not to pay rent, even within this particular season that we're in now, they need to go through all the process that's in place now with the Residential Tenancies Act. They need to be able to show their insurer that they have taken full advantage of all the government support initiatives that are there. They've taken the right steps, and now this is where the rent has fallen behind or that tenant has defaulted. In saying that though, our property investor needs to make sure that A, they have that optional cover on their policy, and B, that their policy wording will respond to this particular scenario that the property investor is in. And not all insurance policies are the same. We've got varying attitudes with insurance companies at the moment, and it does change daily. So that's where you need to look at the individual policy wording and policy schedule. And I'm happy to help anyone that is just unsure in this time.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's one of those the universe putting a great time for you to make a decision in front of us. And that one of those decisions is, am I covered with my insurance policy? And do I have the right policy to protect myself? Which is on what is quite possibly most people's biggest investment they'll ever have. A couple of $100,000 loan. It's a real investment strategy, but making sure you're protected on that front. Fantastic. So stepping back, I had a couple of case studies that I gave, the scenarios. Is there another scenario that I haven't really touched on, Rob or Mike?
Yes, there's about 14 of them.
Give us the top one that we haven't covered.
The one we haven't covered, I suppose, are those who are in genuine hardship. And because I want to make sure we touch on this, on how investors can manage that process, both in a kind way and to protect their bum at the same time. So yes, you want to be kind. So this is one of the things I talked to Sue Ellen about a few weeks ago about my own property, and another one for a client. And that's why a broker is much better to have in your picture when you're an investor than just going to a local insurance company directly. So it's when there's a problem that you need people like who are in that's the status of giving advice. So in the case, I think it was given, my client needed to give a rent relief to their tenant. It was fair. They were down quite a bit of money. So the rent relief options are, you can give a discount and say, rather than paying $400 per week, you can pay $300 for the next 2 or 3 months. You can do that unofficially, and you've got no leg to stand on, and Sue will touch on this. But if you wanted to give a discount, you can give a deferred payment. So you can defer them $100 a week, for example, over 3 months, and that's a different scenario. I'm talking to Rob this morning, there's no real time limit on when that is, when that needs to be paid back. It may just be within their lease, or it may be left hanging after the lease. So if you can defer some of that rent, then you're still, in most insurance policies, you're still covering yourself for that loss of rent or rent default. You might want to elaborate on that one, Sarah.
That's right. It's very hard to be specific, and I need to be very careful what I say here. It is purely general advice only.
And straight up the front to support you on that, Sue Ellen, please no one make a decision on anything we give. make sure you check with your property manager expert, your insurance people, or reach out to Mike, Rob, or Sue Ellen before you make any decision. But this is information for you to think about so that you can go and ask the right questions to the right people. So yeah, definitely jump in, Sue Ellen.
Sure, thanks, Ed. As far as rent default goes, there are some policies out there that will provide cover in that scenario that Mike has just provided, but there's others that have more restrictions on when they will pay, how much they will pay, and also the period that they will pay for as well. And that's also changing for existing policies now. As recently as yesterday, we received an announcement from an insurer that whilst you may have, a property investor may have an existing policy with the optional rent default cover, where that was previously an agreed amount, that amount is now being retracted, as well as the time period that that rent default cover will be there. So it's such a moving platform still at the moment, but I need to look at specifics to be able to provide any more specific information.
And I think that's a great reason why you should have a good broker to support you with that insurance, because policies are changing and the insurers will be changing. That if you're just locked in with the one insurer direct, you won't be aware of that and you won't have any other options to diversify. So,
can I just add to that though? I know that this session today is concentrating on managing your property investment during this COVID season. But don't forget, there are other perils, there are other events that will happen outside of the COVID season with rent default. There'll be storms. We're expecting severe storms this afternoon. There's rain, there's water damage, pipes let go, flexi hoses let go. And that's probably one of the largest claim or most frequent claims for any domestic property is water damage from burst pipes or burst hoses. So property investors need to think broadly as well, and like Rob and Mike have already said, they need to stay very close to their property managers or their tenants if they don't have a property manager. Communication is key.
Yeah, fantastic. And
I think I'd just add to that, Ed. Mike was talking about having a negotiation with your tenants. It's key that you document all of this. The Residential Tenancies Authority has released a new form for 18D, which you formally document this process. The tenants then agree to those terms, whether they are a discount or a deferral of rent. And as Mike said, you then, considering the implications, if someone's only impacted by COVID-19 for a period of 2 to 4 weeks while they're waiting for government benefits to come through, then that's all the period of time that you're discounting or deferring the rent for. And therefore the repayment terms on that short period of time would be reasonable. But if you had to look at giving someone some discounts or some deferral for a longer period, then again, the repayment terms on that would need to be given in consideration to how long it would reasonably take someone to repay that.
Yeah, and obviously the increased risk for the owner as well with long payment plans.
Yeah, so a question for Rob on that is that if you're going to drop your rent for your tenant, would you be saying they need to do a new lease or an amended lease to cover that? And then that also then ties back into a potential insurance claim, I understand.
No, the guidelines from the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, which we're a member of, are to keep the fixed term tenancy in place, and that the Form 18D is an amendment or an annexure to that agreement. So the original agreement of 6 months, 12 months stays in place. This is an amendment for a specific period of time under a very unique set of circumstances, that once those circumstances are no longer in place, you revert back to the original fixed term agreement.
Yeah, fantastic. And just makes it more important as you're throwing those form numbers out that you get an expert in to help make those decisions and make sure the process is done properly.
Can I just jump in there, Ed, please? In support of that, from an insurance point of view, there are some insurers that will either not accept insurance on your property investment or they'll restrict the cover if you're not using a property manager to manage the property. I know in my own situation, I have ditched a property manager and gone direct to the tenants in managing my property. Just be aware that that is a risk. Some policies do require you to go through a property manager rather than dealing with the property direct. And as Rob and Mike can vouch for, it certainly there's lots of other benefits, not just an insurance benefit there.
Yeah, fantastic. So we had a question come through the Facebook group about how can we evict commercial tenants, and how's that all playing out at the moment in the current landscape? So love to talk about that, and we might throw over to you to start that off, Rob.
Yeah, look, like I said, the Australian government has released a national mandatory code of conduct. Now, it's not legislated, it is only guidelines, but what they have suggested in there is the same as they have with residentials. Landlords must not terminate leases due to non-payment of rent during COVID-19 where the tenant is directly impacted by COVID. Now, there's no legislation at the moment stopping them from doing that. But I go back to the same position, Ed. You're much better off to have a good long-term tenant than to remove someone in these uncertain times and have uncertainty of a vacant property for another unknown period of time. So everyone is suggesting that we negotiate to maintain a good tenancy, whether it's residential or commercial. But no, there's nothing stopping a landlord evicting a commercial tenant. Should that go to court, I suggest that the courts would see in favour of the national code of conduct that the government's put in place. So there's risks there for the commercial landlord.
Yeah, totally. And I think the commercial space could be really interesting post-COVID, as a lot of people have realised they may not need as much commercial space as they evolve their business. So losing a good tenant in this current market could be a big long-term risk for your commercial property, I imagine.
And bearing in mind, there are reductions in place for owners of commercial property, be it land tax and other measures that have been put in place to try and ease some of that benefit. So there are things that a commercial landlord can look at to offset the loss in rent.
Yeah, for sure. Were you going to say something, Mike?
Oh, just in terms of some case studies, again, I keep referring a few people to Rob because he does cut across commercial as well. But I'm seeing there's a bit more flexibility out there shown on the residential side of things from landlords. And I'm certainly hearing of more resistance on the commercial side. There are some parties who are just refusing to negotiate, or they're giving ridiculous negotiations. One client of mine's got a business up in Manly, and they're giving them some slight rent relief, but they're saying you've now got to extend your lease out another 6 years. So things like that, the questions come up, is that appropriate? Will they get away with that? They're doing it for their own purposes to increase the value, long-term value of their commercial lease. But in terms of if a landlord refuses to play ball and says to the retail customer, I'm not going to play ball, Rob, what does your retail client do? What does the lessee do in that case?
Well, they don't have the residential tenancies authority as the residential tenants do for mediation purposes. They've got to go straight to court. There's no mediator in the middle.
Yeah, and they can go to the lawyer and get the lawyer involved to try and facilitate that.
Absolutely, the lawyer can conduct mediation.
Yeah. But it can become challenging quite quickly. And I've heard quite a lot of landlords asking for some things that are becoming a bit unreasonable, like last 3 years profit and loss trading statements and disclosing all that sort of information. So really worth getting accurate advice before you start, if you're the tenant, before you start handing over too much and negotiating too much with those landlords.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in there and
I was about to throw to you, Sue Ellen, totally.
Oh, thanks, Ed. Something that Rob was saying about, if property owners are thinking of removing a tenant and having a property vacant for some time, that also creates some concerns for insurance, because every property insurance policy has an unoccupancy clause in there that the insurance company is prepared to continue cover for a certain amount of days, and that varies. We are seeing a lot of relief in that area now during COVID-19, where a lot of insurers are saying, look, we're not going to apply that strict 60-day unoccupancy clause or 90 days, whatever their particular policy might be. So at the end of the day, a vacant property is obviously the last thing that any property investor would want to be having. But just keep that in mind, that if you do find as a property investor you have got a vacant property, even if you're a homeowner and not just an investor, but any property, if it does become vacant for a period of time, get in contact with your insurer or your broker and just, once again, be open with the communication. There's ways around that, and there's things that we can do to continue the cover.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks heaps for that, Sue Ellen. And I think so we've covered that. The final question that I had prep loaded in, which is specifically to you, Sue Ellen, is when people are looking at their insurance clauses in this time, like obviously those documents are highly unreadable for the average bear. Where should they be looking? What are the clause titles, sections that they should really be paying attention to, so that instead of looking through the whole thing, they can just zero in on the important stuff?
Yeah, so they do certainly provide some good bedtime reading. And it's something that I do most days, is reading these types of documents. But there's two very important documents to read, and they must be read together. So it is the policy wording, or the product disclosure statement. So that's the booklet that has all the jargon, all the fine print in that. There will be a section in there that will refer to rent default by tenants. And then you need to further find a section in that area that defines, on what basis is the rent default going to be covered. Is it a list of defined events that the insurer will pay on? In addition to that booklet, and that section in that booklet, you must look at the policy schedule. So that's where it shows you your address and the property value that you're insured for, because that will show whether or not the policy has any optional covers that have been taken out, like the rent default by tenant. So it's two important documents you need to look at.
Yeah, that sounds like far too many documents for me to get my head around. Why I'd go to an expert and ask them.
Ed, I've got to totally disagree with Cyril on that one. Don't do any of that sort of stuff at all. Just make sure you pick up the phone, ring Sue Ellen, because tell her what your insurance company is, she'll find out what the policy details are.
I'll help you.
Then she'll give you advice on the next one, because they may not have the right cover for you anyway.
That's totally what I'd do. That's totally what I'd do.
Thank you.
For sure. Now, did anyone, Duncan or Kelly, did you guys have any questions, Beverly? Let me just bring up the chat box again. I might just
add something while they're coming up with their questions.
Yeah, totally. I was going to flip it to you guys.
There's some new rules in relation to ending a tenancy, even if your tenants are impacted by the COVID-19 at the moment. So these are for very specific circumstances, and there's just three of them that I wanted to touch on. The first is if the property owner or their immediate family needs to move into the dwelling. So if for whatever reason they can't continue to support two mortgages and they decide to sell their principal place of residence and move into the investment property, they can give, there's a notice period, there's still the standard times that we have to deal with, but you can give tenants notice to vacate the property if you need to occupy it. Also, if you need to sell the property, if you're in financial hardship for whatever reason and you need to sell your investment property, you can give notice to your tenants and have them vacate the property, even if they are impacted by COVID. So there are some measures there to protect the landlords, the owners of those properties, if they find themselves in really difficult circumstances.
But that hasn't changed the notice periods?
Still 2 months notice needs to be given. And if someone's in that situation, it would be prudent for them to take that time to find somewhere else to live.
Yeah.
So if they do find somewhere sooner, and it is a negotiation process, the tenants can request to have that time shortened, which I'm sure the owner, if he was looking to move in or to sell the property, would be more than happy to accept that.
Yeah, for sure. No, fantastic. So we've had no other questions come through. Did Mike, Rob, or Sue Ellen, did you have any last pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share before we wrap this masterclass up?
Well, I'm happy to finish, but others can go first. But one of the things I'm happy to talk about is where the market is, to some degree on rental, but where the property market is going here and interstate. But I'll leave that till last, if you like, for those who might be interested in that.
Yeah, perfect. Rob, anything else from you?
I just wanted to very briefly just mention self-managed super funds. For anyone that has a self-managed super fund and owns either residential or commercial property in there, they'd understand that there is a complex set of regulations and legislation surrounding those at the best of times. With everything that's impacted by COVID, you need to be very careful that you document correctly all the decisions that you make, and particularly if you have related tenants, you need to ensure that you absolutely dot your I's and cross your T's, and I'm more than happy to have a chat to anyone that wants to discuss that further. There is relief available in that sector, but you've just got to make sure that you don't put all your other superannuation assets and investments at risk when all you need to simply do is prepare and have the right documentation in place prior to making a decision.
Yeah, fantastic. Good call, Rob. Sue Ellen?
Look, I'll probably just finish my part by saying that insurance is a small piece of the overall management of a property investment. And I can't stress enough the importance of dealing with experts like Mike and Rob to make sure that you've got the right property for you, but also that it's being managed in the way that you should have it managed. So yeah, insurance comes after all of that. So I'm more than happy to help anyone. We do a lot of residential investment properties, but also quite a big portfolio of commercial property owners as well. So I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about their portfolio. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sue Ellen. And so over to you, Mike, for the last bit. And I think it's really interesting, and a lot of people will be interested by this, but about what the market is doing now and what's going to happen over the coming months.
Well, to start with, you'll hear lots of media over the next 6 months even about the market, and usually the media talks about the Sydney and Melbourne markets. It doesn't talk about Gold Coast or Brisbane markets. So just be aware of what you're hearing. It's probably from those markets to one. There is no single Australian property market. There's no such animal. That's an often thing that's assumed, but it's not the case at all. Each state will have each area or city, I suppose, will have its own, it's a base level. And we saw that when the Sydney always leads a national growth chart. It always starts in Sydney. And Sydney flew up in 13, 14, 15, 16, and then found it at a high level, and then come back again once the government stepped in and hosed things down, hosed lending down. And so it found its base level. Melbourne did the same thing, and Brisbane, we kept waiting for Brisbane to go, and Brisbane just didn't go. It just ticked over and ticked over. So Brisbane hasn't had any growth. So in this phase, we're not going to see as much of a drop in property values is what some people are fearing. I'm a bit more concerned about the Gold Coast itself. The Gold Coast is often a problematic market when it comes to investment property. It's quite varied. But we'll see that the Sydney market probably will come back to its 2017 levels, I believe. But it's slow. So it's not like shares. People panic with their share portfolio when they smell COVID-19, and they panic, and that changes it, and it changes every day based on people's emotions to a fair degree. Property is a thing that you can't just go out and go, I'm going to panic and sell it. It takes months to get to this sort of stage. And as we're going to be seeing, this is a hibernation phase. It's not really a long, drawn-out recession base that's built up, where everybody's losing their jobs and it's going to take years to get them back. It's largely a hibernation phase. So we're going to see that protected to some degree. There won't be the big panic that we're expecting. I think Sydney will come back down to its 2017 levels from bouncing up 10% in the last year or so. Melbourne will come back to those levels as well. The Gold Coast, I think, will suffer, but that's a longer story. And the Brisbane didn't really have its growth. So we'll see the Brisbane market, which is where I'm pointing most of my clients to for investing now, is from May onwards. I've held them back until now. I'm saying the last 2 months I've said, don't buy, don't buy, don't buy. You don't need to, even though that's how I get paid. I'm saying, don't buy just yet. Wait and I'll tell you when. There's a great little window coming up in May, and it's the Brisbane market they'll be directing people to. You will see some media headlines around some areas of Brisbane. There'll be the odd one where people will sell out, but it's really not much of that happening. And talking to the real estate people around the place here and in Brisbane too, we're not seeing much of that happening already, largely because people aren't under mortgage stress. If they're under mortgage stress, like the guys were saying last week, you can get a delay of 3 months or 6 months on making your mortgage payments. So that mortgage stress is not going to be there. And we'll get through this time. And when you look at the stats, I've got more. If people want to ask me, I'll send them some of my background info. But we'll see where Australia is looking to head next year. We're going to suffer economically this year to some degree, but there'll be a big bounce back. In areas like Brisbane, where they've got major infrastructure in place, it's already been funded, it's already started. So those factors that are causing Brisbane to have its pending growth boom, are still going to be there over the next 1, 2, 3, and 4 years. So there's no big problem. The Gold Coast is more of a problem, but most people, we live here. Don't worry about your house prices. You'll be still living in the same house in most cases anyway. Not a problem for you. If you've got investment property, again, don't panic. Hold on. Manage your relationship with your property manager. Get your tenant to pay the rent. But it's not the time to sell on the Gold Coast either, even though you'll suffer a little bit for a while longer than more than most states.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks heaps for that. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our masterclass. Thank you very much, Mike Harvey, Rob McCaskill, and Sue Ellen Greaves. Really appreciate your team, and a great example of the Business League collaboration and supporting each other, getting some great advice so you can make the best decisions. Of course, if you want to join one of the Business League events, feel free and jump in. The next one is on Wednesday, the 6th of May. We have over 100 people booked in for an amazing speaker, and looking forward to seeing you all there. Apart from that, thanks everyone for turning up. If you've got any personal questions, when I post the recording in the group, Mike, Sue Ellen and Rob, I'll get your details put in there so people can reach out to you. But apart from that, well, thanks everyone, and have a great rest.